All right, so thank you all for tuning in today. Today's webinar, we will be reviewing the discussion chapter. And as you can see in the chat here, we have some links, so please feel free to refer to those resources. At the end of the webinar today, we will have a Q&A session. So as we go through, you can put questions in the chat, or you can save them till the end, and then we will review those at that time. So these are the elements that we'll be reviewing today. We'll be going over the introduction, interpretation of findings, limitations, implications for practice, recommendations for further research, and then the summary. Also, just want to make sure you can all hear me. If somebody could just maybe throw something in the chat. All right, great. Okay, so the introduction of this chapter, like each of the others, will start off. Wendy, I see you're asking, how do you mute yourselves? Right now, you're all muted, but if you want to come off mute during the Q&A, we can do that. Okay, so back to the introduction. So here you'll want to reorient the reader to your study. So by this point, you will have done this a few times throughout your dissertation. You're going to be reminding the reader of the purpose for your study, why the study is needed, and also why it's important. You can also provide a brief preview of what you'll be presenting in the chapter coming up. And here you'll also want to restate your research questions using the same language that you have throughout the chapter so that you're maintaining consistency with those research questions. The bulk of this chapter is going to be this piece, the interpretation of the findings. Throughout your paper, you'll make conclusions and recommendations for practice or recommendations for further research, but all of that will stem from this piece here where you're interpreting the findings. So it's really important to have a solid foundation built into this piece so that when you are describing those things later on, they're all coming from this chunk here. So interpreting the findings means that you are going to be relating what you found to the findings of previous research in the area that you are focusing on, and really talking about where your study is situated within that previous research, and then you can make the interpretations based on that. So your findings might differ, they might coincide with previous findings. So here you'll kind of describe what that looks like. So you may refer back to your chapter 2 and pull in previous literature that you've already identified in your literature search and call out a specific study that had similar findings to your research, or really pinpoint where the findings differed and provide some explanation for that. So again, just really thinking about how your study relates to the previous literature. One way that you might organize this is by using subsections and headers. This will be helpful for both you as a writer to just get it all down in an organized manner, and also for the reader to really follow and have a good flow in your paper. So if you are conducting a quantitative study, then you may want to make these headers based on your research question. It's also important to remember that if you are doing a quantitative study, this chapter is not a statistics heavy chapter. The results chapter, so just before where you're talking about your results, is where you'll really want to provide all of those statistics and tables and a really in-depth description of your findings. But in this piece, in the discussion, you're going to want to talk about the meaning of these findings. So not necessarily reiterating or regurgitating those statistics, but only providing statistics that are going to be very relevant to that actual meaning. Then if you are doing a qualitative study, you may organize this instead of by research question, by themes or sub-themes that you've identified in your analysis. If you are working on a mixed methods study, you can kind of do a combination of the two. Typically in mixed methods, the The qualitative piece is used to provide more information on the quantitative. So you may want to start out with describing your quantitative data by using sections broken out by your research question or research questions. And then once you've done that, provide maybe a paragraph or two on an in-depth description or discussion on the qualitative piece. So you can kind of do what makes sense depending on what you're studying and kind of mix and match these organization methods. So here you'll want to talk about your findings again in the context of previous research. So that might look like saying something like, in the present study, we found that postpartum depression relates to lack of social support. And this confirms previous research. And then you might cite the previous research that was found in. So sentences like this will help you really connect those literature search pieces and orient your reader to your particular study, in this vast field of research. So in addition to discussing your findings along with other major research, you should also provide information for whether or not your findings are adding something new to the literature. So, identifying any novel findings that you found or anything that you haven't identified already in your chapter 2. Here, you'll just want to describe those as well. And also explain findings that don't support previous research. And then in that same vein, outline why they might not support previous research. So it could be that your sampling method or your population differed from a previous paper, and that's why, or that's why you think that your findings are not matching up. So here you'll want to explain that a little bit as well. And then you'll repeat each of these steps for each of the research questions or themes that you've already defined in your study. So it's a kind of just repetitive process of going through, restating or summarizing the findings, discussing how they contribute to the research, and then identifying any new or different findings for each piece of your dissertation. The next section in this chapter will be the limitations. Here, I always recommend referring back to your proposal for a starting place. In your proposal, you probably outlined or anticipated some limitations that you may run into. So that will kind of spark some ideas for this section. One thing to note here is that limitations should only be things that occurred that had potential to change something in your study. So really drawing that distinction between a challenge and a limitation. So if it's a challenge, it may have posed difficulty, but if it didn't actually affect your results, or if it couldn't potentially affect your results, you don't need to report that here. So some limitations that you might describe are things like not being able to access a particular data set, or not being able to achieve a specific sample size. So right now, very commonly, we see people not being able to maybe get a sample size that they were aiming for due to not being able to conduct surveys in person or different restrictions related to the pandemic. So those are just some examples of limitations that you might report in this section. Next, you'll want to discuss the generalizability of your results to the larger sample population. So usually if your study is quantitative and you had a sufficient number of participants, the chances are that your findings would generalize pretty well, especially if you use a sampling method like random sampling, which is better than a convenient sample, where you're just using people you have access to. So if you have those kind of methods in place already, then your generalizability is probably pretty well. So here you'll want to describe that and describe what steps you took to achieve that generalizability. Or also, if there were drawbacks, you'll want to describe why your sample or why your study is not generalizable to the greater population. So again, going back to that sample size, maybe you were only able to recruit half of what you had hoped to. Here you'll want to talk about that. And then if your study is qualitative in nature, it's important to note that qualitative studies generally do have a smaller sample size. You may just be interviewing, 20 people or less. So here it's worth explaining that the findings are not necessarily generalizable, but that's by design because you are doing a qualitative study. Instead, your findings are more meant to shed light or insight on a specific phenomenon or process that you're studying. So here you'll want to talk about those two things. Now, the next two sections, so implications for practice and recommendations for further research, here's where you're going to talk about, why your study is important or why these findings are important and how they really relate to the real world. So in the implications for practice section, you're going to talk about how the population that you're studying or the population that you're drawing inferences from can make use of the data that you have created, right? So if you are doing a study that is specific to K through 12 teachers, here you might talk about how they can put your findings into practice. So that might look like maybe your study identified that teachers feel they need more training in a specific area or more professional development activities. So here you may be able to give some recommendations for what that would look like in the real world. Same thing here. So what do your findings mean for professionals in the field? Again, really just talking about how can this be implemented? So not just thinking about it conceptually, but really think about it practically. What can teachers glean from this information, and how can administrators support teachers in using it? Here, you may also want to weave in your theory in this section. If there's obvious places where it might stand out, you don't necessarily need to weave your theory into each research question, but if there's specific areas where that lend themselves to talk about it, this would be the section that you would do that in. So for recommendations for further research, again, we're going to be talking about how your findings are going to be contributing to that research that is to come. So you may want to, again, discuss some of the limitations that you found. If you will go back to the sample size example, if you were not able to achieve a sample size that you had hoped for or that you think would be really meaningful for your findings, here you might say that a future research should replicate this study but aim for X sample size. So just providing recommendations for maybe shortcomings or pitfalls in your study that you think others can do to kind of create or generate findings that might be more generalizable or might glean a new research question or provoke different thinking. If you have findings that don't support previous research, you may here describe that you're based on what you found and based on the previous research that you've identified, the findings might be inconclusive, and therefore future research should aim to kind of look at this again and give indications as to what they might do. So maybe they should be using a different research design. Maybe they should be using a different population, different levels of instruments. So here, just really thinking about your findings and what could others contribute and what changes can be made in your paper that may be helpful. And then the last slide or the last section here in your chapter is going to be a summary. So I always recommend with anything in the chapter, refer to a template from your school to ensure that you're including all the elements that they're expecting. So you can get that from your chair or your committee, just asking them to see maybe previous work that students have done or just a general template, because each school may have slightly different requirements. And then here you're just going to be recapping the major points from the chapter. So those big take-home messages that that the reader should leave with. Again, not regurgitating the statistics, but really those implications for practice, recommendations for future research, and just bringing it conceptually into the real world. And then here, I just wanted to share with you all our contact information. If you feel that you might benefit from a more one-on-one type of session or just have questions that you'd like answered, we do provide full service dissertation consulting for all of the chapters. So feel free to reach out to us. And I believe this information will be in the chat as well. We also have a webinar archive on our website, and we hold webinars for many different chapters. So if you're struggling with others or you just need some more support, even with the discussion, please do check that out. We have a lot of resources online. And now we will open up the floor for questions. So if you have a question, feel free to use the chat feature or the Q&A. And if you don't have questions, just thank you all for joining today. Again, our contact information is in the chat, so feel free to reach out. Okay, so we've got our first question. When referring back to the theoretical framework, is it better to restate the constructs used? Yes, this is something you can do. I think it's really going to be a question of the organization of your chapter. So if you're weaving it in a way that you're able to use headers to go through those constructs, I think that can be very helpful. Should we review our hypotheses again here or stick only to research questions? I would structure it based on your research questions. It sounds like you're doing a quantitative study, and then weave that hypotheses into those implications for practice and the recommendations for future research. There you'll be able to kind of expand more on what you expected to see, why didn't it happen, or why did it happen, you know, and expand more on that there. Do we have any more questions? All right, well, I will stay on just in case any more questions do pop up. But if not, thank you guys for joining. Thanks, have a nice day. Hi, Nicole. No worries. The webinar will be available on our website. So I see that you have a question about organizing the findings for your qualitative study. I can unmute you and we can kind of talk about it. And if you can't talk, that's okay too, but okay.
That would be wonderful. I was just trying to type in I was typing as fast as I could.
No worries.
I'm just trying to figure out, I'm doing a qualitative study. And I am trying to organize my findings. And I have two different approaches that I discussed with my chair, but I'm not sure which direction to go in. And I was wondering if you had an opinion on, is it better to go with a thematic approach, but then after that, then just make sure you've answered the research questions. I was worried that that might be a little redundant. That's some of what I'm saying in my thematic approach. Then I'm stating again in response to making sure I covered answers to the research questions, or is it better to just organize everything by research questions and see if there's something thematic?
Yeah, I think that your first approach is better to go with a thematic approach.
Okay.
So, you can have like theme 1, and then maybe if there's sub themes under that, go with those as well. And then in the description of the theme, you can say, to weave in your research question, you can start off by saying something like, theme 1 answered research question X. It was developed through, and talk about the codes that developed it. And then you can say something like, from theme 1, I don't want to say developed again, but you'll wordsmith, but we uncovered 4 sub themes. So you're including the research questions, the sub themes, and then how you develop the theme all in one paragraph. So
just kind of, and if that theme it applies to 2 research questions, then you're kind of just weaving that into that thematic and sub-themed kind of section. Okay, it doesn't have to be like a standalone section. Right. No, it can be all in one. And then one way too to get at this maybe earlier in the chapter is in your results chapter, if you provide a table that shows your themes and then the research question that aligned with that theme. That's perfect. I already have that set up. Oh, yep. There you go. Yep. That was for me, but yeah, that would be great to include that. Yeah. Perfect. And even you can include the codes that contributed to each theme, and so that they can kind of draw a straight line from code to research question. Oh, good call. Okay. Yep, I'll add that in. All right. Thank you very much. I can't wait to watch the full video. Okay. All right, so I'm going to close out the session. Thank you all for joining and have a great day.